So it's not true that you can't do anything at all with the German government about trade, but you are very limited. Most of what you have to do has to be with the EU, and as yet we've seen no practical signs of a reset. In fact, if anything, the Prime Minister still seems to be taking a very cautious approach, which is to say we're not really planning for what the EU wants, in which case it would be quite a struggle to get anything from the EU to improve that trade relationship significantly.
Just talk us through the significance of this meeting. What was discussed and what new was announced?
Yes, hello from Berlin Airport. It's a pretty important meeting for Keir Starmer because what he sees this as is the real kind of start of a reset of the relationship with the EU. He wants to bring Britain closer to the EU. He thinks there is lots that can be done on things like trade, on cracking down on illegal migration, on the environment, on science and tech, things like that. But he thinks that this treaty that you mentioned in your intro there, which he's hoping to have agreed by the end of the year, is going to be the first step in that. But what the other things that were discussed were Ukraine, a defence pact. They've got a new joint action plan to tackle illegal migration. But what this isn't, that he is very, very clear what this isn't, is not reversing Brexit. He says the promises he made, not going back into the single market, not going back into the customs union, no free movement, they remain. But he believes that there can be closer relationships without having to succumb on those points.
I watched the speech, I'm sure as you you obviously did, but he seemed to be trying to have his cake and eat it too. No revisit of Brexit, but a once-in-a-generation reset of the relationship with the European Union. You can't have one without the other, can you?
Well, it's very tricky, and I think that's the challenging, steps that it'll come up against when this is being discussed with Brussels. Because, of course, we can discuss this treaty that we're talking about, and Number 10 is very clear this is being discussed within the existing frameworks, existing agreements that are already in place. Because launching a new trade deal, well, that just couldn't happen with Germany bilaterally because it is part of the single market. So it is very tricky, and you're kind of left with the question, well, what exactly can you get within the constraints that we must now operate in after Brexit?
Well, let's, Jerry, thank you very much. Let's talk to someone who's dealt with these kind of things close on at the coalface, as it were. David Henig, who's the UK director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, used to work as a trade negotiator at the Department of International Trade. David, can you help us with this contradiction? He talked about a wider reset, but at the same time said he didn't want to revisit Brexit. Can you square that circle?
Well, this visit hasn't squared the circle. So what we've seen in Berlin is good bilateral noises. There's a lot of interest from Germany in increased security cooperation, and there may be things that can be done to ease certain frictions in terms of market access, but they won't be significant within this. You could maybe set up a cooperation group to see how certain services trade could work better or something like that. But this is not going to be a significant boost to UK trade. For that, you would have to talk between the UK and Brussels. And that obviously hasn't started yet.
Because just to give some basics to this, he's talking about a bilateral deal with Germany, but trade is governed by a deal between the UK and the European Union. There's no separate trade deal with Germany.
I mean, broadly, that's correct. So the EU has complete competence over EU trade policy, and the trade and cooperation agreement is between the UK and the EU. There are things that fall within member state competences, some issues that can affect trade, such as some of the regulations, for example, on financial services. You can have some of a discussion about that, some defence industry issues potentially. So it's not true that you can't do anything at all with the German government about trade, but you are very limited. Most of what you have to do has to be with the EU, and as yet we've seen no practical signs of a reset. In fact, if anything, the Prime Minister still seems to be taking a very cautious approach, which is to say we're not really planning for what the EU wants, in which case it would be quite a struggle to get anything from the EU to improve that trade relationship significantly.
Of course, there are domestic political reasons as to why Keir Starmer doesn't want to revisit the whole idea of Brexit. But in the fullness of time, might he see a rapprochement, the wrong word, the wrong language, with Germany as a gateway to a European deal?
rapprochement with Germany, wrong language, is not the gateway to a European deal or improved trade relations with the EU. You have to go through Brussels, and we've seen this since 2016. The idea, the German car makers are going to come to the rescue. The German car makers don't come to the rescue. The German government has very little say, in fact, in the way EU handles third country trade relations with the likes of the UK. They have some say, of course, but this is very much in the hands of the European Commission in Brussels. So in a way, this is a little bit of a sideshow. It's actually a little bit reminiscent of the early days of Theresa May's government, of talking to large member states, Germany and France. That's not where the real action is going to be. The real action is going to be in Brussels. And we still wait to see that. To be fair to the new government, the European Commission has yet to form, so they had elections. There is a new commission being formed. There will be new interlocutors for UK cabinet ministers. And only when that happens, which is probably by the end of the year, will we see serious engagement between London and Brussels.
So we know what Keir Starmer has ruled out. He says he's not going to rejoin the European Union. He's not going to talk about rejoining the customs union or the single market. Is there again, to use a Labour phrase, not a third way, but a fourth way forward, where you could do a bit more without actually going over the white lines you've already painted?
Oh yes, those red lines are have been well set, but there's plenty that you can do within that. You can ease agricultural trade with a veterinary agreement. That was in the Labour manifesto. They also talked about more recognition of professional qualifications, mobility for touring artists. Obviously, the EU has put youth mobility on the agenda, which has caused some issues in London. You can do much more than that. You can do plenty around aligning regulations to ease business access between the UK and the EU, and also to remove frictions that have been caused between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. So there are various bits and pieces, and if you make that a consistent pattern, that could help investors to think, yes, the UK is a stable place to be to locate a hub for the whole region. So there are things you can do that can make an economic difference. They may not be hugely significant, but they all count. So yes, there are things that can be done. We've not really started on that path yet, and with regard to Germany, I don't think today's visit gets us any closer to that. As I say, that has to wait for talks with Brussels.
Some things here for Starmer to think about. Thank you very much, David Henig, international trade expert.